Welcome back to the Piping Pastor. Today we'll be initiating our discussion of Theodicy, or the problem of evil. Today I am smoking on my Boswell pipe, and in it I have my plum pudding bourbon barrel aged reserve. I finally just got into this yesterday, so this is my day 2 on this blend. And I have to say, I really rather enjoy it. I was concerned initially that the bourbon barrel aging process would make it come off a bit too sweet, because that's typically what happens when you age things in oak barrels generally. That's why unoaked Chardonnays are usually referred to as more crisp, while oak-aged Chardonnays are referred to as buttery. And while this does have a bit of buttery sweetness to it, it really plays nicely with the blend. And it's the typical plum pudding blend. So it's got Cavendish, Black Cavendish, Latakia, Virginias, some Perique, but it all plays really, really well together. It's a delightful smoke. I'm not going to get into all the different notes and so forth. I'll leave the tobacco reviews to Mutton Chop and Spurgeon Piper. But suffice it to say, I enjoy it. And they have in each tin a little chunk of the bourbon barrel that it was aged in. So I think a clever little addition. For today, I'm in a rather lighter outfit because it is warm here in Maryland. Just returned from all my travels. So first of all, thank you for those who were wishing me well and praying for me while I was on the road. I was joking with my assistant that we seem to be bringing cold weather with us wherever we go. We were in South Carolina, and it literally was like sunny and 72 the week before we got there. And then when we arrived, the temperature dipped down to the 60s and rain. And as we left, it started warming up again. We get back to Maryland, and we're here for less than a week, and it's cold and rainy. It starts to warm up, and we have to go to California, or Denver and then California. And the weather out there was cold again, literally until the day we left. So for the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've been chasing cold weather. So I'm happy to be a bit warmer today. One thing I will say about this tobacco, just as a side note, it is a bit moist. So you want to give it a little drying time. Otherwise, you'll be forced to relight. I figured that out yesterday, and what did I forget to do? I forgot to give it some drying time. So maybe you have to relight this a few times, engaging more in that ritual. Well, I also wanted to mention, I spoke, oh goodness, several videos ago about my Heather Gem cufflinks and my Heather Gem pocket watch, which I'm actually wearing today. And I mentioned the fact that in classic men's fashions, you don't necessarily need to shell out a bunch of money for ostentatious, expensive gemstones. In point of fact, it's generally considered a bit over the top to encrust yourself with a bunch of different kinds of gems. You know, you want to try to keep it minimalistic. But even then, you don't necessarily need to have diamonds and sapphires and rubies and emeralds and so forth. You can go with inexpensive options that still look quite nice. And as an example of that today, I want to show you these cufflinks here. They're antique silver and limestone. I got them in the Lake District in the United Kingdom, and the limestone was quarried locally. And I found these in a charity shop for I think £5 or £6. So they're inexpensive, durable. They look rather nice. They're a very understated cufflink. They're a bit bulky in terms of size, of course, because you can't get too fine when carving limestone. But it's a great color. I mean, gray in classic men's fashions can pair rather easily with just about anything. It's rather like eggplant purple in that. So it does not cost a lot of money to accessorize. accessorize well. But on to Theodicy. Now, in theology, we have the problem of discussing the existence of evil in the world. Now, this is challenging because God is a good God. Right? God is perfect, God is flawless, God is sinless. So how do we explain the presence of evil? Now, this field of study really kind of hits its stride after the Great Lisbon earthquake. The Great Lisbon earthquake occurs on a Sunday, and the sections of town that were absolutely destroyed, that had the most casualties, was where all the churches were. The red light district in Lisbon gets away pretty much unscathed. So after that natural disaster and there were all those fatalities, people stood back for a second and were like, wow, the people who were in church, supposedly doing the right thing, worshiping God, giving praise to the Lord, so on and so forth, they were all crushed, killed, and destroyed. People in the red light district doing every manner of sin imaginable at that time, they're fine. So how do we explain that? Well, thus begins the great pursuit of Theodicy. It's my cold brew coffee, which I'm happy to say I finally got the cold brew pitcher out because of the temperature. Now, of course, people had questioned about, the presence of evil in the world and so on and so forth before that, but it was largely like, well, bad things happen to bad people. If a bad thing happens to a good person, it's God testing that person, like Job, and then they're eventually rewarded. But these people in the earthquake were not rewarded; they were just crushed, killed, and destroyed, right? So they weren't thinking about eternal rewards at that time. They were thinking very much about the here and now, and it seemed that the bad people got away with it. Essentially, that judgment, that natural disaster, should have been hit on the other side of town. So it brings up the discussion of how do we reconcile evil in the world, specifically natural evil. It's a bit easier when we talk about human-to-human interaction, right? The idea of a bad person doing a bad thing to a good person. It's more challenging when we look at like tornadoes, floods, plagues, pestilence, those kinds of things, because they seem to be affecting, innocent people, God-fearing people. And this has been dealt with in a few ways. One way was the idea of double predestination. This comes to us out of the Institutes, Calvin's work, the Institutes. Now, those of you who are Calvinist will be familiar with this because it's one of the most contentious points of Calvinism. Although, in fairness to Calvin, it's barely mentioned in the Institutes. The Institutes is a big work of theology, and this idea of double predestination is really rather small. So it's not as if Calvin built his entire understanding of the universe on double predestination. Or in fact, it's not even called that in the Institutes. That's a label. People come up with it later on. But this is the idea, basically, that everything's decided beforehand. That God already knows who's going where, who's doing what, and it's decided before you're born if you're going to hell or not. And if you're going to heaven, you live a good life, you do good things happen because you're going to heaven. And no matter what, you're going there. If you are a bad person, you rob, kill, destroy, so on and so forth, it's because, well, you were destined for hell. So you're just doing what comes naturally. It's an answer to the quandary of free will versus God's providence, basically coming heavily down on the side of God's providence, that we don't necessarily have free will because everything's already predetermined. So if something bad happens to someone, then it's not because, God's allowing these evil things to happen, this person was already destined for hell. Even if they tried to live a good life and did all the right things, it doesn't matter. It was already decided. And that's why, even though you worked with lepers and orphans, that's why you got the plague. Sorry, just the way things are. Now, I have quite a few theological conflicts with the idea of predestination. Because I'm not a Calvinist, nor am I an Arminian, which is the other side of the spectrum. I'm like halfway in between, because I think there's some good ideas that Calvin had and some good ideas that Armin had. So I don't consider myself a follower of either. I consider myself a follower of Jesus and a person who reads the Bible and does their best to discern God's will for my life. I don't follow theologians. I don't go to the First Church of Armin or the First Church of Calvin. But that's a discussion for another video. So that is one way in which people have kind of tried to deal with this idea of theodicy, of the problem of evil in the world, of the problem of natural disasters and natural evil and so forth. It's the idea that everything's already determined. Good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. Bad things happen to those who are going to hell. Even if they try to live a good life here on earth, it doesn't make a difference because it was predetermined before they're born. And there's some scriptures that they base out of that. Before you were formed in the womb, I knew you, and for those God knew, God also predestined to be with Him in paradise, and so on and so forth. And as I said, I have some theological differences with that, and I believe the biblical interpretation of those texts from some people is a bit strained to get to that point. When I read the text in the original languages, I don't see that as that existing in that way. And I think there's also an answer for that with regards to block time and God existing everywhere and every when at once. I think there's also an answer in that as well, an answer to Calvin's theory and his interpretation of theodicy. So for me, I don't ascribe to that notion of double predestination. For me, I think there are other ways to understand theodicy, to understand the problem of evil in the world, existing in that tension between God's providence and free will, and how that all works out. And there are also, as it happens, of course, within my own particular discipline, answers for this in terms of science and religion. But we will get to that in a follow-up video. So for this discussion, I think I'll have two more follow-on videos for this. So we discussed the idea of where theodicy comes from, and the idea of double predestination, which is Calvin's kind of response to both theodicy and the providence free will argument. In my next video, we'll discuss best of all possible worlds scenario, the argument from science and religion. And then, depending how far we get into that, I do want to do a third video on end times theology. Because while it's not necessarily a subsection of theodicy, people also often pair those together. This idea of the world ending and all the things that happen in that nature with their interpretation of Revelation, the book of Revelation. So in video 3, we'll probably get into that. But in the meantime, I'm going to continue enjoying this lovely pipe of plum pudding bourbon barrel aged reserve. I hope you have a lovely week. As always, happy reading.